The champagne flutes caught the crystal chandelier light like tiny daggers as the most powerful women in New York society gathered for what they didn't yet know would be their last innocent lunch. It was November 1975, and the pages of Esquire magazine had just delivered a literary atomic bomb that would destroy friendships, shatter reputations, and end an era of glamorous complicity that had defined Manhattan's elite for decades. La Côte Basque 1965 wasn't just a short story. It was a betrayal so complete, so devastating in its intimate details, that it would transform Truman Capote from beloved court jester to social pariah overnight. At the center of the wreckage sat Slim Keith, her steel blue eyes scanning the restaurant with the calculating precision of a general surveying a battlefield. Born Mary Raye Gross in Salinas, California, she had reinvented herself so completely that few people remembered the girl who had arrived in Hollywood with nothing but ambition and a body so perfectly proportioned that photographers would later call her the first California girl. Now, at 58, she was about to discover that even the most carefully constructed persona could be demolished by someone who understood exactly which secrets to reveal. "I was not a beauty. I was a style," Slim had once observed with characteristic honesty. But style was about to become a liability in a world where Capote had just proved that friendship was merely research and love was just another form of ammunition. The same razor-sharp wit that had made her Howard Hawks's muse, Ernest Hemingway's confidant, and Truman Capote's most trusted Swan was about to become her primary weapon in a war she never wanted to fight but could never afford to lose. The irony was devastating. Slim Keith, who had spent her life perfecting the art of remaining untouchable while appearing accessible, was about to learn that the most dangerous predators are often the ones you invite closest to your heart. But this was a woman who had survived Hollywood studios, 3 marriages, and the social minefields of Fifth Avenue society. If Truman Capote thought he could destroy her with words, he was about to discover that some swans have claws, and they know exactly how to use them. The California that shaped Mary Raye Gross in the early decades of the 20th century was a place where reinvention wasn't just possible but expected, where the distance from the East Coast created space for new kinds of American dreams to take root and flourish. Born on July 15, 1917 in Salinas, the same agricultural valley that would later produce John Steinbeck's most powerful fiction, she entered a world that was already learning to sell fantasy as reality and reality as entertainment. Her father's work in agriculture provided the family with middle-class stability, but not the kind of wealth or social position that opened doors automatically. From her earliest memories, Mary Raye understood that opportunity would have to be seized rather than inherited, that the advantages she coveted would need to be earned through intelligence, determination, and the kind of strategic thinking that most people her age never learned to employ. The nickname Slim came from her naturally tall, angular frame, a body type that would have been considered awkward in earlier eras but was perfectly suited to the new aesthetic that Hollywood was beginning to promote. By her teenage years, it was clear that she possessed something more valuable than conventional beauty. A presence that could command attention without demanding it, an ability to appear both approachable and untouchable in the same moment. The decision to pursue modeling wasn't born from vanity but from pragmatism. Slim understood early that her appearance was her most immediately marketable asset. But she also recognized that physical beauty alone was a depreciating commodity unless it was leveraged into something more substantial and more lasting. The modeling work that brought her to photographers' attention in Los Angeles was always intended as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The magazine covers that began appearing in the late 1930s established Slim as more than just another pretty face in a city full of them. Harper's Bazaar featured her in spreads that captured something essential about the emerging American woman: confident, athletic, modern without being militant, sophisticated without being affected. The photographs suggested possibilities that went far beyond simple decoration, hinting at intelligence and independence that male photographers found both attractive and slightly threatening. But it was the attention from movie studios that truly changed Slim's understanding of her own potential. Hollywood in the late 1930s was a machine designed to transform ordinary people into extraordinary commodities, and the men who ran that machine recognized in Slim Keith qualities that could translate into box office success. The screen tests and studio meetings that followed were education in the business of manufacturing desire, lessons that would serve her well in all her future endeavors. The irony was that Slim's greatest Hollywood success came not from appearing in front of cameras but from inspiring the man behind them. When she met Howard Hawks at a party in 1940, the legendary director was already famous for creating some of cinema's most memorable female characters. Strong, witty women who could match their male counterparts in intelligence and verbal dexterity. In Slim, Hawks found his ideal collaborator and muse, someone who could help him refine his vision of what the modern American woman could be. The romance that developed between them was both personal and professional, a creative partnership that would influence Hawks's work for years, while simultaneously educating Slim in the arts of storytelling, character development, and audience manipulation. Hawks was 21 years older and infinitely more experienced in the ways of Hollywood power, but Slim brought qualities to their relationship that his previous associations had lacked: an authentic understanding of the confident, capable women he wanted to portray on screen. Their marriage in 1941 marked Slim's transformation from aspiring actress to filmmaker's wife, but it also represented something more significant: her entry into the inner circles of Hollywood's creative community. As Mrs. Howard Hawks, she gained access to conversations and decisions that shaped not just individual movies but the entire cultural direction of American entertainment. The education she received during this period would prove invaluable in all her subsequent social and professional endeavors. The Hawks household became a gathering place for the most interesting minds in Hollywood: writers, directors, actors, and producers who understood that the movies they were making would help define American identity for generations to come. Slim's role in these gatherings was never merely decorative. She was a participant whose opinions were sought and valued, whose insights could influence million-dollar decisions about casting, scripting, and marketing. But the marriage also taught Slim important lessons about the limitations of being defined primarily through someone else's achievements. While she enjoyed the privileges and access that came with being Howard Hawks's wife, she also began to understand that sustainable power required developing her own identity and her own sources of influence. The Hollywood wife who depended entirely on her husband's success was ultimately just another kind of employee, subject to dismissal if circumstances changed. The relationship with Ernest Hemingway began during the war years when the famous writer was spending time in Hollywood, working on projects and socializing with the creative community that had embraced Slim and Howard. Hemingway was already a legend, someone whose books had helped define modern American literature and whose larger-than-life personality made him a fascinating companion for anyone interested in art, adventure, and the complexities of creative achievement. The friendship that developed between Slim and Hemingway was intense and complicated, based on mutual respect for each other's intelligence and a shared understanding of the performance aspects of public life. Both of them had created carefully constructed personas that served their professional needs while protecting their private selves, and both understood the exhausting nature of maintaining such elaborate disguises over time. The rumors about a romantic relationship between them were persistent but never confirmed. and Slim herself remained carefully ambiguous about the exact nature of their connection. What was clear was that Hemingway represented possibilities that her marriage to Hawks couldn't provide: intellectual stimulation, literary credibility, and the kind of adventurous lifestyle that appealed to aspects of her personality that Hollywood society rarely engaged. The tension between her loyalty to Hawks and her attraction to what Hemingway represented created internal conflicts that Slim learned to manage but never entirely resolved. The choice to remain married while maintaining her friendship with Hemingway was both practical and emotional. She valued the stability and social position that her marriage provided, but she also needed the intellectual and emotional stimulation that Hemingway offered. The correspondence between Slim and Hemingway, some of which survived and was later published, revealed the depth of their connection and the careful way they navigated the boundaries of their relationship. Hemingway's letters showed genuine affection and respect for Slim's intelligence, while her responses demonstrated the wit and insight that had made her such a valuable collaborator for Hawks. But the friendship also highlighted the limitations of Slim's position as a woman in a world still largely controlled by men. Her relationship with both Hawks and Hemingway was ultimately dependent on their approval and interest. She could influence their work and their thinking, but she couldn't determine the terms of the relationships or control how they developed over time. The end of Slim's marriage to Howard Hawks in 1949 marked the beginning of her transformation from Hollywood wife to independent socialite. But it also represented a kind of liberation that she had been preparing for throughout the 1940s. The skills she had developed, the connections she had made, and the reputation she had built gave her options that most divorced women of her era simply didn't possess. The move to New York in the early 1950s was strategic as well as personal. Manhattan offered opportunities for reinvention that Hollywood couldn't match, and the city's social hierarchy was complex enough to provide multiple paths to influence and recognition. Slim understood that New York society valued different qualities than Hollywood: wit over beauty, style over spectacle, intelligence over charm. And she was confident that she possessed what was needed to succeed in this new arena. The apartment she acquired on the Upper East Side became her stage for the next phase of her career as one of America's most influential social figures. The carefully curated interior, the perfectly planned dinner parties, the strategic cultivation of friendships with artists, writers, politicians, and business leaders, all of these were components of a comprehensive campaign to establish herself as an essential figure in New York's cultural life. The marriages that followed her divorce from Hawks were different in character and purpose. Leland Hayward, the theatrical producer, offered connections to Broadway and the kind of cultural credibility that came with association with serious theater. The relationship was based on mutual professional interests as much as personal attraction, and both parties understood that they were combining resources as much as hearts. The third marriage, to Kenneth Keith, brought Slim into contact with international society and the kind of wealth that opened doors to European aristocracy and global influence. Each relationship taught her something different about power, money, and the social dynamics that governed America's elite circles, while also providing her with the resources and connections necessary to maintain her position as an independent force. But it was the friendship with Truman Capote that would define the most important and ultimately most destructive relationship of Slim's later life. When they met in the late 1950s, Capote was already famous for his early novels and was beginning to establish himself as a social figure who could move between the literary world and high society with unprecedented ease. The attraction was immediate and mutual. Slim recognized in Capote someone whose wit and intelligence matched her own, while Capote saw in Slim the perfect embodiment of the kind of sophisticated American woman he wanted to chronicle in his writing. Their friendship began as genuine affection between two people who understood the performance aspects of social life. and who could appreciate each other's skill at playing their chosen roles. Capote's concept of the Swans, the group of beautiful, wealthy, sophisticated women who became his closest friends and most trusted confidants, was both flattering and dangerous. Women like Slim Keith, Babe Paley, Gloria Guinness, and Morella Agnelli were treated by Capote as living works of art, perfect creatures whose lives provided him with material for observation and analysis. The intimacy that developed between Capote and his swans was unprecedented in the normally guarded world of high society. These women, who had spent their lives carefully controlling information about themselves and their families, found in Capote someone who seemed safe, a homosexual man who posed no sexual threat, a brilliant conversationalist who made them feel intellectually appreciated, an artist whose friendship conferred cultural legitimacy on their otherwise purely social existence. The lunches, dinners, phone calls, and confidential conversations that characterized these friendships were exercises in mutual seduction. Capote gained access to the most private details of lives that were normally hidden behind walls of wealth and social convention, while the Swans enjoyed the attention of someone whose talent they respected and whose friendship made them feel special and understood. Slim's relationship with Capote was particularly intense because they shared similar backgrounds in reinvention and self-creation. Both had transformed themselves from provincial origins into sophisticated figures who could navigate the most exclusive social circles, and both understood the exhausting nature of maintaining such elaborate personas over time. The conversations between them ranged across topics that Slim rarely discussed with anyone else. Her frustrations with the limitations of being defined by her relationships with men. Her observations about the dynamics of power within high society. Her sometimes cynical understanding of the motivations and weaknesses of the people around them. These discussions provided Capote with insights that would later prove invaluable when he began using their friendship as raw material for his fiction. But Slim also shared with Capote details about other people. Gossip about affairs, financial problems, family scandals, and personal weaknesses that were considered absolutely confidential within their social circle. The trust that allowed such revelations was based on the assumption that Capote would never betray it, that their friendship was more important to him than any literary project could be. The warning signs were subtle but persistent. Capote's increasing alcoholism, his growing obsession with completing answered prayers, the novel he claimed would be his masterpiece, and his occasional comments about the material he was gathering all suggested that the relationships he had cultivated might serve purposes beyond simple friendship. "Capote will kill us with his words," Slim observed during one particularly frank conversation, but the comment was made half-jokingly, without real understanding of how prophetic it would prove to be. The idea that someone they trusted so completely could use their confidences as weapons against them seemed impossible to imagine. But it was exactly what was about to happen. The publication of La Côte Basque 1965 in Esquire magazine in November 1975 was a social earthquake that destroyed friendships, ended careers, and redefined the boundaries of loyalty and betrayal within America's elite circles. The story, presented as fiction but clearly based on real people and actual events, revealed intimate details about affairs, financial problems, and family scandals that had been shared with Capote in confidence during years of trusted friendship. For Slim Keith, the betrayal was particularly devastating because Capote had used not just her secrets but her voice, her mannerisms, and her distinctive way of seeing the world as raw material for characters who were clearly recognizable to anyone who knew her. The literary skill that had made Capote such a compelling friend was now being used to dissect and expose the very people who had made his social success possible. The immediate reaction within New York society was swift and merciless. Phone calls went unreturned, invitations were withdrawn, and friendships that had seemed unbreakable dissolved overnight. Capote found himself exiled from the world that had provided him with material, companionship, and social validation for nearly 2 decades. But for the Swans, the damage was equally severe and perhaps more lasting. The details revealed in Capote's story made them objects of gossip and speculation rather than admiration, transforming them from elegant figures of mystery into subjects of prurient interest. The carefully maintained privacy that had been essential to their social positions was destroyed, and with it much of their power and influence. Slim's response to the betrayal was characteristically direct and uncompromising. While some of the other Swans retreated into wounded silence or attempted to maintain dignity through denial, Slim chose confrontation. She understood that Capote's attack required a response, that allowing his version of events to stand unchallenged would mean accepting a diminished position within the society she had worked decades to master. The campaign that Slim mounted against Capote was both personal and strategic, conducted with the same intelligence and ruthlessness that had brought her to power in the first place. She understood that in a war of words and social positioning, victory would go to whoever could most effectively control the narrative and isolate their opponent from potential allies. The first phase of her counterattack was information warfare. Slim began sharing stories about Capote's own vulnerabilities and hypocrisies, his increasing alcoholism, his financial dependence on wealthy friends, his history of betraying confidences when it served his purposes. The same social networks that had once carried Capote's gossip now became vehicles for damaging revelations about his character and reliability. The strategic use of media was crucial to Slim's response. She gave carefully calculated interviews to journalists who had previously covered both her social activities and Capote's literary career, ensuring that her perspective on the betrayal received equal time with his artistic justifications. The goal was not just to defend herself, but to expose the predatory nature of Capote's behavior toward all the women who had trusted him. But perhaps most effectively, Slim used her understanding of how high society operated to orchestrate Capote's systematic exclusion from the world that had made him famous. Phone calls were made, favors were called in, and social pressure was applied with surgical precision. The same hostesses who had once competed for Capote's presence at their parties now found reasons why he couldn't be included on their guest lists. The campaign was brutal, but necessary. Slim understood that in a social ecosystem where reputation was currency and access was power, Capote's betrayal could not be allowed to stand without consequences. The message had to be sent that using friendship as research material and trust as raw material for fiction would result in complete social exile. The other Swans watched this battle with a mixture of admiration and horror. Babe Paley, true to her character, maintained a dignified silence while privately supporting Slim's efforts. Gloria Guinness withdrew even further into her carefully constructed mystery, refusing to engage publicly with the controversy while making it clear through her actions that she sided with the betrayed rather than the betrayer. The effectiveness of Slim's campaign was measured not just in Capote's increasing isolation, but in the speed with which former allies abandoned him. Publishers who had once competed for his work began expressing doubts about future projects. Social figures who had treated him as essential entertainment started treating him as a liability. The transformation was swift and comprehensive, demonstrating the power that could be wielded by someone who truly understood how their world operated. But the victory came at a personal cost that Slim had not fully anticipated. The energy required to orchestrate Capote's destruction was enormous, and the constant focus on the betrayal kept the wounds fresh in ways that simple anger or grief might not have. The campaign consumed years of her life and significant emotional resources, leaving her drained and sometimes bitter in ways that were foreign to her naturally optimistic personality. The social isolation that resulted from the scandal affected not just Capote but all the Swans to varying degrees. The same society that had once celebrated them as perfect creatures now viewed them with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. The intimate details revealed in La Côte Basque had made them objects of prurient interest rather than admiration, transforming them from elegant figures of mystery into subjects of gossip and speculation. For Slim, the challenge was rebuilding her social position without appearing diminished by the attack. The strategy she developed was characteristically bold. Instead of retreating from public view, she increased her visibility, appearing at charity events, gallery openings, and social gatherings with a defiance that dared anyone to treat her as a victim rather than a survivor. The transformation in her public persona was subtle but significant. The woman who had once been known for her wit and charm now added an edge of steel that made it clear she was not to be underestimated or trifled with. The lessons learned from the Capote betrayal had hardened her in ways that were both protective and potentially isolating. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw Slim gradually rebuilding her social position, but on different terms than before. The automatic deference and respect that had characterized her earlier dominance never fully returned, but she developed something perhaps more valuable: a reputation for being someone who could not be destroyed by scandal or betrayal, someone who possessed the kind of resilience that was rare even among the elite circles she inhabited. The relationships she formed during this period were more carefully calibrated than her earlier friendships. The experience with Capote had taught her to maintain emotional distance even in seemingly intimate relationships, to protect her secrets more carefully, and to never again trust anyone completely with information that could be used against her. But the wariness that protected her also limited her in ways that were sometimes painful to acknowledge. The spontaneous warmth that had once characterized her interactions with friends was now filtered through calculations about loyalty and reliability. The woman who had once been known for her openness and directness had learned to be more guarded, more strategic in what she revealed and to whom. The 1980s brought a different kind of recognition as the fashion world began to acknowledge Slim's historical importance as a style innovator and cultural influence. Retrospective articles in fashion magazines celebrated her role in creating the American sportswear aesthetic, while museum exhibitions featured photographs and artifacts from her various incarnations as Hollywood muse, Broadway wife, and international socialite. This historical recognition was both gratifying and melancholy. Being treated as a living legend suggested that her most influential years were behind her, that she had become a figure of historical interest rather than contemporary relevance. The California girl who had once embodied the future was now being celebrated as a representative of the past. The years that followed the publication of La Côte Basque, 1965, were marked by a gradual recognition that the world both Slim and Capote had inhabited was disappearing. The kind of society that had made their friendship possible, intimate, exclusive, based on personal relationships and shared secrets, was being replaced by something more public, more democratic, and ultimately less forgiving of the kind of elaborate social games they had all been playing. Slim's attempts to rebuild her social position were partially successful but never complete. She remained a figure of interest and influence within certain circles, but the automatic deference and respect that had characterized her earlier social dominance never fully returned. The betrayal had revealed vulnerabilities that could never be entirely forgotten or forgiven. The memoirs that Slim published in 1990, shortly before her death, represented her final attempt to control the narrative of her own life. Slim, Memories of a Rich and Imperfect Life, was both confession and justification, an honest accounting of her choices and relationships that sought to explain rather than excuse the complex person she had become. The book revealed aspects of Slim's character that her public persona had always hidden: insecurities about her background and education, frustrations with the limitations imposed on women of her generation, and a sometimes painful awareness of the prices she had paid for the life she had chosen to live. But it also demonstrated the intelligence and self-awareness that had made her such a formidable figure. Her ability to analyze and understand the social dynamics that had shaped her experiences. The final years of Slim's life were not a gradual fade, but a conscious retreat into the kind of authenticity that had once been too dangerous to display publicly. The Fifth Avenue apartment remained a masterpiece of interior design, but the constant stream of visitors had dwindled to a few loyal friends who remembered the woman beneath the carefully constructed persona. One evening in 1989, as she sat alone beneath those same crystal chandeliers that had witnessed decades of triumph and betrayal, Slim Keith put pen to paper for the last time as a public figure. The memoirs she was completing would be her final act of self-creation, her attempt to reclaim control over a narrative that others had tried to write for her. "I was never perfect, but I was unforgettable," she wrote, and in those words captured something essential about her entire approach to life. The imperfections had made her human, the unforgettable quality had made her dangerous. Capote had discovered too late that some swans don't just accept their fate. They fight back with everything they have. The death that came on April 16, 1990 was quiet and private, but it marked the end of something larger than one woman's life. With Slim Keith's passing, an entire approach to social power and personal reinvention died with her. She had been the last of her kind, a woman who understood that in a world controlled by men, style could be more powerful than beauty, wit more lasting than wealth, and authenticity more dangerous than any secret. The funeral was attended by survivors from every era of her reinvention, but the most telling absence was Truman Capote himself, who had died 6 years earlier, still estranged from the world that had once worshipped him. The friendship that had seemed so essential to both of them had ultimately destroyed more than it created, proving that some predators are too dangerous to keep close, no matter how charming they might seem. In the end, Slim Keith achieved something that none of her fellow swans managed. She wrote her own ending. Capote thought he had written her final chapter in La Côte Basque, but Slim Keith wrote it herself, not in ink, but in claws. She was not a beauty, she was a style, and style, unlike beauty, does not forgive but endures. The swan with claws had the last word after all.